All right, welcome to day 2 of the chessboard visualization training program. And our task today is pretty straightforward. We're just going to be looking at the normal development squares for the pieces from their starting positions. And so, first of all, I want to look at the starting positions for the knights. So we have a board with just the knights that are on their starting positions. And we just want to look and see where these knights develop to naturally from their starting position. So we'll start with the B1 knight and work our way around the board. And one thing to note, B1 is a light square, so this knight can only go to dark squares. The most natural developing square for the B1 knight is C3. And the next most natural developing square for that knight on B1 is D2. Note they're both dark squares. Now let's move over to the knight on G1. It's on a dark square, so it has to move to a light square. And its two most natural developing squares from the opening to move to are F3 and E2. And I know this might seem a little simple, but it will help, believe me. We got to just kind of, become one with the board, so to speak, and just break it down into simple elements. So let's move over to the black knights. So the black knight on B8 is on a dark square, so it can only develop to light squares. And its natural developing squares are C6 and D7. So just look at those and make a mental snapshot. The knight on G8 is on a light square, so it has to develop to dark squares. And its natural developing squares are F6 and E7. So that's the knight. Now let's move on to the bishops from their starting squares. So I'm going to reset the board with just the bishops on the board in their starting positions. All right, we have the bishops set up on their starting positions. And so let's go through and look at the natural developing squares for all the bishops from their starting positions. So for the bishop on C1, it's on a dark square. Notice it is part of this, X-wing extended corner. That's a dark squared corner. It's on the left-hand side, so it's part of the dark square corner, extended corner. And its natural developing squares are D2, E3, F4, and G5. So just take a good look at those natural developing squares for our dark squared bishop on C1. Now let's move over to our light squared bishop on F1. Its natural developing squares are E2, D3, C4, and B5. So just take a little bit of a mental snapshot of that image. Now let's move over to the to the black bishops, and we'll start with the dark squared black bishop on F8. Its natural developing squares are E7, D6, C5, and B4. So just take a good look at that. And then we'll move to black's light squared bishop. Its natural developing squares are D7, E6, F5, and G4. All right. And now what we'll do is let's look at the squares that these bishops will develop to when they fianchetto. So The dark squared bishop for white, when it fianchettos, goes to b2. The light squared bishop for white, when it fianchettos, goes to g2. The dark squared bishop for black, when it fianchettos, goes to g7. And the light squared bishop for black, when it fianchettos, goes to b7. So just take a good look at that. And now what we'll do is we'll just put the kings and rooks on the board, and we'll take some mental images of what squares the kings and the rooks land on after they both short castle and long castle. So I will set that up. All right, so we have the kings and rooks in their starting positions, and what we're going to do now is we're going to look to see what squares the king and the rooks land on after both regular castling and long castling. So when white long castles, the king ends up on g1 and the rook ends up on f1. When it long castles, the king ends up on c1 and the rook ends up on d1. Now, if we move over to the black king, when the black king castles, when it castles kingside, the king ends up on g8 and the rook ends up on f8. When black castles long, when it castles queenside, the king ends up on c8, which note is the same color square, and the rook ends up on d8, which is actually a different colored square. It went from a light square to a dark square. However, note that when the king castles to the short side, the rook ends up on the same colored square because it only moves over 2 squares. On a long castle, it moves over 3 squares. And now what we're going to do is we're going to look at those same development squares, but we're going to take the pieces off the board. So I will do that right now. All right, so now we just have an empty board. And I do want to mention real quickly that don't get discouraged thinking this seems too easy and that this is going to be at too low of a level. If you're under 1800, trust me, it will get more difficult as we go along. But it's important that we kind of, do these more simple tasks in the beginning. So now what we want to do is let's name the squares that are the starting position for each knight. So let's look at the board and just imagine the knight, the queen's knight on its starting position. Name that square and name the color of that square. I'll let you do that and then I will do it. So it's B1. Now look at and name the squares that knight can develop to from its starting position, its most natural developing squares. Note that it's a light square, so it has to go to a dark square. And those squares are C3 and D2. All right, now let's move over to the king's knight, the knight that's on the king side for white in the starting position. Name the square and just mentally state the color of that square. So that square is G1 and it's a dark square. And now name the natural squares it can develop to and the color of those squares. So those squares that it can develop to are F3 and E2, and they are both light squares. So now let's go to black's knights, and let's start on the queen side, and let's look at the square, state the square out loud and the color of the square. The square is B8. It's a dark square. And now let's identify the squares it can naturally develop to. Name those squares and what color they are. So it can naturally develop to C6 or D7, and they are both light squares. All right, so let's move on to the last knight, and it's the kingside knight for black. So identify its square that it's on in the starting position, name the square, and name the color. So the square is G8. It's a light square, which means that it has to develop to a dark square. So identify the two squares that it can develop to, state the name of those two squares, and the color of this square. All right, so the square is F6, a dark square, and E7, a dark square. All right, so let's move on to developing squares for the bishops. And let's start with the white queen's bishop. Name the square that it is on in its original position and the color of the square. So it's C1, it's a dark square. And now name all of the squares that it can develop to and what color those squares are. So those squares are D2, E3, F4, and G5. Now let's do the same thing for the white kingside bishop. Name the square and color that it's on at the beginning of the game. And that is F1, a light square. And now name and state the color of all the squares that it can develop to from its starting position, its natural developing squares. So those squares are E2, D3, C4, and B5. Now let's do the same thing for the black side. And let's start with the queen's side bishop first. So name its starting square and color. And that square is C8, a light square. And now name all of its natural developing squares and those squares' color. And those squares are D7, E6, F5, and G4. And finally, let's do that for the kingside bishop for black. Same routine. And its starting square is F8. And the squares it naturally develops to and the color of those squares are E7, a dark square, D6, a dark square, C5, a dark square, and B4, a dark square. Now, let's name the squares, and this will be the longest video that we do. So please, proceed to the rest of the videos in this course. Trust me. But let's name the square that the C1 bishop can develop to when it fianchettos, and the color of that square. And that's B2, a dark square. And let's name the square and the color of the square that white's kingside bishop develops to when it fianchettos from F1. That square is G2, a light square. Now let's do the same thing for the black bishops. And let's start with black's queenside bishop. And let's name the square that it can fianchetto to on the queen side and the color of the square. And that is B7, a light square. Now let's do the same thing for the king side bishop. It develops to G7, a dark square. And finally, the last thing we'll do for today is let's name the squares and the color of the squares that the kings go to when they castle and the rooks go to when they castle. So let's do it for white. Let's name the square that the white king goes to when it castles kingside and the color of that square. So the white king starts on E1, it goes to G1 when it castles, and it goes from a dark square to a dark square. When it castles queenside, it starts on E1, and name the square it goes to and the color of that square. It goes to C1, another dark square. And now let's look at the rooks, white's rooks, when they castle. So when white castles kingside, the rook starts on H1, a light square, and name the square that it finishes on and the color of that square. So it starts on H1 and it finishes on F1, a light square. So it stays on the same color. Now let's look at where the rook starts on the queen side and where it ends up when we do a queenside castle for white. So the rook starts on A1, a dark square, and now name the square and the color that it ends on. It ends on D1, a light square. So it actually changed colors because it moved 3 squares instead of 2 squares. Now we'll do the same thing for the black pieces. So the black king starts on E8. Let's name the square and the color of the square that it ends on when it castles kingside. So it starts on G8. It starts on E8. It finishes on G8, which is a light square, the same color as its starting position. When it castles queenside, it starts on E8, of course. And what square does it end on? Name the square and the color of the square. So it ends on C8, which is also a light square. Now let's do the same thing for the rooks. Let's start with the kingside rook. So before we castle, the kingside rook is on H8, a dark square. Now name the square it ends on and the color of that square after it castles kingside. So it ends on F8, another dark square. So let's do the same thing for the queenside rook when we castle queenside. It starts on A8, which is a light square. Name the square that it ends on and the color of that square. So it ends on D8, which is a dark square, different color square. And the reason is it moved 3 squares over instead of 2 squares, as it did when it castled kingside and ended up on the same color. So that's it for today. Now I believe that's probably the longest that we'll ever go. So that's, significantly longer than the 10 minutes probably. But I think it's just it's a useful exercise to kind of set the stage as we go forward. And believe me, things will get more difficult as we go. So please stay with it. We did a lot today, so don't feel like you have to do any of the vision trainer in chess.com or the coordinate trainer in Lichess. You certainly can if you have the ambition and the energy left to do it. But I think that's good for today. And then we'll be back tomorrow with day 3.